I'm Josh Schick. I'm a curator at the World War II Museum, and today we're going to talk about paint. Fun, exciting paint. This is a subject that I really got into when we were doing restoration work with PT 305 at the World War II Museum, and I was doing some other research, and you just kind of realize that World War II is a really heavily black and white war. I know that from my experience as a kid going to a lot of museum ships are usually gray. There's a lot of, let's see, I'm gonna do a little screen sharing here. There is a lot of interpretation in movies that includes dealing with just kind of gray ships as they are. Here we go, PowerPoint. And we are going to talk about the evolution of camouflage. So you got this great picture here. This is the USS Indianapolis, haze gray and underway. You know, it's a really common term you hear in reference to the Navy and everything. And while gray is a camouflage color, it is part of the Navy, it's heavily used. That's not really a thing during the war. You've got this ship painted pre-war, standard Navy gray. She's just cruising along. But in this photo is 1939. Within just a few years, you've got the same ship completely done up in a camouflage scheme. Now, this is representative of what's called Measure 32, which we'll kind of get into the schemes and measures a little bit more in a little while. This is sort of the pinnacle of color shifting on ships as a means of camouflage. Radar ruins the party shortly after this, but this is sort of the height of it. And so really I want you to realize that during World War II, it wasn't just gray. You've got all kinds of colors across the spectrum: blues, greens, blacks, browns, whites, all these different versions of coloring that was used for a whole bunch of different reasons. Just to kind of define what we're talking about from camouflage, I know like the classic camouflage and it's the beginning of time, ever since someone cut a branch off of a tree, stuck that branch in front of themselves to break up their shape and make them disappear, that's camouflage. Now, for ships, it splits into two different basic types. There's painted camouflage, which is what we're going to talk about, and then there's physical camouflage. Physical camouflage is not really used on modern ships of the World War II era while they're underway or fighting. It's just not practical. You can see the below picture is physical camouflage. This is the USS New Orleans after she got her bow knocked off. She's heading to Loggy. They're trying to shore up the bow and get the ship going, so they took a bunch of native foliage and nets and draped it over the ship in an attempt to break up the shape and everything. As you can see, something like this would not be practical when you're sailing. However, it works very nicely for that. But that doesn't work while you're underway. So you don't really see a lot of physical camouflaging on ships during the war. Another version of that would be changing the structure, like adding a second funnel or smokestack, maybe changing the shape of the guns to try and confuse the outline. And I think one more thing to definitely consider as we go through this, on ships, camouflage is not intended to make it disappear. I mean, everyone understands that's in camouflage. It's a given that a ship sticks out on water. There's nothing to hide behind. There's no trees or rocks. You can't take a whale pelt and stretch it over your ship and say it's a whale. You need to come up with different ways to show different parts of it. So we're going to talk about the origins. Camouflage really kind of starts at the end of the age of sail when we get to modern ships, steel-hulled ships, you know, turreted guns, coal in this case. And this is the USS Olympia, and it is rocking a scheme called white and buff. This is what the Great White Fleet looked like when it sailed around the world. White and buff was popular at the time because it shows that you have got a clean ship. A warship, when it's not engaged in combat, is a symbol status, a status of the state. And so if you've got a ship that's white and tan like this, it's difficult to maintain that. You get a lot of rust while ships are underway, a lot of wear and tear. But if you are a rich enough nation or a rich enough Navy and you can come into town and you've got this brilliant, beautiful, conspicuous painted ship, you're showing off. Now, the extent of camouflage from this whole white and buff time period during the war, this is going to be a photo of the same ship, the USS Olympia during the Spanish-American War. They just painted them gray. They figured that this was the best color for fighting on the gun line. This really isn't quite reached a point in naval warfare where we're doing anything other than lines of battle. And so they figured gray breaks the silhouette up on the line of battle. But in reality, we're burning coal and we're firing a lot of smoke powder. So it's pretty obvious where the ship is anyway. Now, the next greatest evolution and the thing where we get dazzle from is the First World War. This comes out of Britain. United States follows suit. And the whole idea is to follow what does it look like when a submarine is attacking you? And so you're looking at a very low angle of observation. You also need to think about when a submarine makes an attack, it's either on the surface at night, so there's some obstruction from light anyway, or they're making a periscope attack, in which case they constantly raise and lower their periscope. They don't leave it up because it can be spotted. It leaves a feather, a splash in the water. You don't want to expose yourself. So think about popping up your periscope, you see this, and you're trying to figure out which direction it's going. You drop your periscope down, and you're still planning your attack. If this was colorized, you'd actually see bright reds, whites, and blacks, a lot of different colors. And really the idea is to just absolutely confuse you. Now, the interwar period, like most things in the military, there's a huge drawdown in spending and funding and everything. And there's also a lot of reflection looking back. Hey, what did we learn in the First World War? Well, there was two competing thoughts behind camouflage in the First World War, pushed by artists and naturalists. Naturalists are people that study nature, so they were looking at how animals blended in nature. They had two thoughts. Dazzle ended up winning, which is confuse speed and direction. But they also thought maybe you can paint in colors that your eyes have trouble adjusting to, and you can sort of make the shapes meld into the background. Shading is a really big, important thing for that. Following the First World War, they studied all this, and they said, okay, dazzle didn't necessarily make the number of sinkings smaller. It didn't increase them. They didn't really see what effect it had, but they were able to determine that it made people feel good about themselves. Guys on the ship felt good that their ship was painted in this ridiculous, crazy scheme, and it would be a lot harder for them to be seen or found or anything of that nature. The U.S. Navy is really the only one that actually keeps researching into this. The British kind of shut it down. The U.S. Navy opened a small office in 1920. They go through a couple of drills. They do some studies. And by 1935 to 37, they have published a manual that will determine U.S. Navy camouflage patterns for the remainder of the interwar period and the World War II period until the advent of radar. And this one is called Ships 2. They eventually, 25 schemes, of which 21 are officially adopted, come out of this, and it's really laid out as an instruction manual. It talks about types of paints, reflectivity, the theory behind it, and then approved schemes. And it really sought to digest all of the different information that people wanted to know, from counter shading versus dazzle versus all these different schemes and thoughts and everything. And this is the only service that really tries to digest a lot of this material and make it worthwhile. So we'll stop and talk about paint just really quickly. The Munsell Book of Color, which is something I found when I was first doing this. It's basically a book of dedicated colors, tell you what the hues and the lights and the reflectivity and all of that is. All the colors are based on that. A lot of the colors that are used in camouflage, it's pretty fascinating, were created by artists who were literally just would go out and look at the sunset or look at the ocean, look at the different things. And this is how we get such a diverse number of colors across the board for camouflage, is because they realize that these colors need to be adaptable per their environment. You can't paint a ship to fit the British Isles and then send it down to the Mediterranean and expect those colors to be similar to that area. So it's a good thing to bring up is that camouflage is decided, the colors and the pattern, for the point at which a vessel is going to be in the most danger. So a battleship, before the advent of air power, is going to be camouflaged for a long-range gunfight in the sunlight or sunset. A submarine will be camouflaged for action at nighttime. A landing craft, like an LCI, will be camouflaged for working close inshore. So that means that oftentimes these schemes don't work whenever that vessel is doing something that's not that point of action or that most obvious time. Another important element in paint is the reflection factor, basically the amount of light reflected. So white paint reflects more light, dark paint absorbs more light and reflects less. A big thing that we take advantage of in camouflage and coloring, and I'm gonna make sure I'm saying this word properly because it's kind of a mouthful, is the Purkinje effect, which is the tendency of the human eye to shift towards blue colors in low light. So that's why a lot of ship colors, it's not just because the ocean is blue, I mean, happens to be blue with it, and so is the horizon, but you use a lot of blue colors, and even a lot of the colors they call gray look bluish because they want to take advantage of low light situations or shading where your eyes will shift towards a blue spectrum. Gloss is the paint shiny or not shiny? And in camouflage, you do not want or use shiny paint. They happened to use oil-based paint back in the day, which was always gloss, and so they had to add tinting agents to it where they could take that reflectivity off, but shiny is bad. One last thing to mention about paint is that it's all mixed from a base color, which is usually a gray, because that's interwar colors and everything, and then they add tinting agents and they add flattening agents to it. So for modelers out there and for anyone else trying to sort out camouflage schemes, this from a historical and thinking research standpoint is a little bit nerve-wracking because it means that they don't just go to the hardware store, bring their paint chip and have it mixed on the computer. They actually had to follow the recipes. So if someone has got a little heavy hand with the tinting agent, their deck blue might come out or navy blue, or might shift back towards ocean gray. So it's kind of the person that's doing the mixing is sort of, it's at their mercy. So I'm going to talk about a couple of just the basic schemes that were used. Now we can do a lot. This is a very complicated subject, so I'm trying to just skip the surface with a couple of these. So we're going to talk about some of the basics. Solid scheme. So that's when we paint the entire ship one solid color. This is an excellent example of pre-war. We've got the Colorado here. Solid schemes were used pre-war and late war. Pre-war because just like that gray before, we're using it on the battle line, so we feel that that blue blends in with that horizon a little bit more, makes it a little bit more difficult to see. We're talking ships of the line, slugging shells at long distance. The other thing that it ends up coming into play as we start painting ships more solid colors later in the war, especially in the Pacific theater, this is more difficult to see from aerial observation. And that's the big difference between the First World War and the Second World War. First World War, we're trying to mess up your view from surface, either periscope level or gun director level. In the Second World War, we have airplanes to worry about. So there are some things you can't camouflage about ships, like their wake, but you've got a better chance of blending in with the water from an aerial shot as you do with any other colors. Another thing, now this one's a little bit cheating because there appears to be just a whole bunch of dudes wearing dress white uniforms walking around on deck. It's a little bit not fair. They wouldn't be up there during combat conditions. Another thing to think about is the type of blues that they use for these. So next scheme, USS Kidd, another just classic solid blue scheme. You can see how sometimes it doesn't blend in with some things. You've got a horizon line here, and this is going to be important in some of our later schemes. Really awesome picture. So we've got the USS Dayton. Pre-war, I think this shot's from fall of 41. Solid scheme. You can see how it blends in with the ocean. Bow waves and wake are still a little bit of an issue. But this one has a really neat effect in that thin structures such as masts or antennas, things of that nature, were painted lighter colors so they could blend in with the horizon. So if you look at this vessel, just forward of that stack and aft of the bridge there, you see the mast going up, and bloop, they've got a nice little horizon line painted on it. And keep in mind with all these schemes, it's not to make you disappear. You're not playing Invisible Man with the ship. It's really to mess up the attacker in the moment. If you're making a run with your aircraft, maybe you misidentify the vessel. Maybe you don't get the speed or direction correct. If you're popping up and down with your periscope, maybe you're confused by what you saw. That's the whole point, is to increase your chances of getting away with it. Submarines are worth mentioning. Something really fascinating about camouflage when I started looking into it. First World War, they found that some German submarine captains would paint their conning towers white. White was a very divisive color in the First World War, and it actually kind of makes a lot of sense too. And the ultimate reasoning was white is very difficult to see at night on the surface. Reflects a lot of the light. It's a low light situation, so there's that effect where you're shifting towards blue. And I keep seeing it, and it's a great argument. Think about the Titanic. Big white iceberg, no one saw it coming. We can do a lot of debates about, you know, binoculars and everything, but in reality, something that's stark white on a black ocean really starts to blend in. Now, submarines in the U.S. Navy were painted black pre-war. There's a couple of different schemes and everything, but one of the primary things a submarine has to do is it needs to hide while it's underwater. World War II submarines spend most of their time above the surface. However, when they're submerged, if you're flying over them with an aircraft, you can see the shape of a submarine. So you paint the conning tower white, that could be great for a nighttime attack, or some sort of very light blue, which is a peak time for submarine attacks. However, if you need to be submerged when you're being hunted by an aircraft, that white is going to stick out through the water. So there's a lot of thought behind it. That's why they're usually black. I call these gimmicks, but this was an early attempt at a pattern scheme. This is the USS Northampton. The Northampton here is painted with a rather tremendous false bow wave. So the idea behind this is that we paint this white curl on the front of this ship. In this photo, she's really not moving, or she's moving just ever so slightly forward. But the idea is, if you look at this from a surface level, you're going to see her running with what they say in naval terms, running with a bone in her teeth. Looks like a dog carrying a bone, just a big, huge, frothy white wake, because this ship is really making high-speed revolutions. So the thought is, we'll put this false bow wave on there, and they're going to get the speed wrong, and they might miss with their torpedoes. Ultimately, they found that this just wasn't visible enough. It was just kind of a waste. One of those things made everyone feel good on the inside, and it looks cool when it's sitting in port, but from a practical standpoint, doesn't really do the trick. Same thing, you see a lot of early war pattern schemes that take advantage of cool colors, cool splotches. They look awesome up close, but they realize pretty early on, I think this is a version of Measure 12, that once you back up at any sort of appreciable distance, it looks really awesome, but these just kind of meld together and it just ends up looking like a ship. And so this is when they started to say, well, what is the point of this? Now, pattern schemes did work fairly well for landing craft. And once again, very good in the Pacific theater. This is where you see a lot of the greens, browns, and blacks get applied to landing craft. Think about the environment that these guys are in. Yes, they travel on the high seas, but for the most time, they're vulnerable when they're beached. And they're also closest to the enemy, in theory, when they're beached. So you may as well paint them in a scheme that matches the islands that they're sailing in, or can help them blend in with the beach. The idea is, you know, you've got aerial observation, a float plane flies over, maybe they don't see a couple of LCIs working their way up the coast on a resupply mission. These are also some of the cooler looking schemes, honestly, and they're very modeled and painted, spray painted, airbrushed on there, but they work because you're dealing with a lot closer visual ranges for these. Good underway shot. I've been asked before, well, then why do they paint camouflage and paint the numbers on it? It does seem a little ridiculous, but ultimately you want your team to know that it's you. Organization is very important in landing operations, so you need to know what landing craft is doing which. Like I said, camouflage is not a cure-all. It's just a increase your chances. So mid-war, we start to see graded schemes. And these schemes are the first attempt at helping solve the problem of, I want a deceptive scheme that makes me misidentify this vessel, or I want a scheme that hurts the ability to see it. So these graded schemes use two colors. They create what's called a false horizon. So you've got two blues that help you from aerial observation. If you're flying off at a distance, you're looking down at, like 60-degree angle or something like that, you're going to see blue on blue. So you may miss the vessel or you may misjudge what it is. With the false horizon, if you're looking at it at sea level, you might not realize that this is a full-size battleship. With that false horizon on there, you don't really realize how much freeboard is there. So is this something smaller? Is it a cruiser? Is it a destroyer? It also has the effect of making it look like the ship is physically further away with that false horizon on there. Plus, it looks pretty cool. So the last category, basic category of schemes are deceptives. Now, this is, aside from looking awesome, this is really the pinnacle of painted camouflage development in any Navy. These end up becoming, for the U.S. Navy, what's called Measure 31, 32, and 33. And what these are a mix of are deceptive. So what kind of ship am I looking at? What direction is it going? What speed is it going? And that counter shading, that attempt to kind of nullify the curves and lines of the ship. So pretty awesome looking. I think something that's good to point out with this, so a false bow is very popular in Dazzle of the First World War. Is this the front of the ship? Is this the back of the ship? This is the USS Missouri. You see a really great example of this. If you look on the far right of the ship, that's all painted ocean gray, and then there's a slash where it switches to black, and that gives you a false bow or stern. There's also a great example of counter shading in here. If you look at the center of the ship in the superstructure, it's all painted black. There's a lot of catwalks there. There's a lot of different decks. There's a lot of structures. And they realize that if you paint a ship in some sort of cool pattern, as soon as the sun gets above it and casts a shadow, all of a sudden it's popping. It's just really easy to see. So you try and darken up areas that would be in shadow, and you lighten up areas that would not, or the other way around, depending on what you want to do. So dark up there in the middle so it nullifies the shadows. However, if you look at the bow on the left side of this image, the very tip by the bullnose, there's a curl of light paint that follows the deck line there. That bow flares up. So if the sun is up, that area that's painted that light color is going to be cast in a dark shadow. Outside the limits of that shadow, it's been painted black. So they're trying to even up those colors. What's unique about these patterns and schemes too is all previous patterns were sort of at the mercy of the ship commander or the regional commander. They would just bust out that ship's 2 camouflage manual. They'd say, all right, you're operating in the Pacific. These are the colors you use. These are the approved schemes. We can suggest something if you want it. These schemes were actually developed specifically for capital ships and were issued from a design office in DC. And this is how it comes. It's a paint by numbers for your battleship. So you get your battleship, you get a couple hundred guys and a couple hundred gallons of paint, and you bust out this sheet and you start to paint by numbers of your ship to break it up. This one happens to be specifically for the battleship Texas and the New York class so New York or Texas. And their whole idea is, let's break up the form of this vessel. USS Randolph, this is a really neat picture too. This is a measure 32 as well. Look at this really quickly and see if you can immediately tell which side's the bow and which side is the stern. It does a really good job of balancing all this out. It also has a false horizon as well. It uses that flight deck and it colors everything from the flight deck up. There's a little bit of a smudge in there with lighter colors to help them blend in. So think about how all that works. It's pretty awesome picture. And I think last, we've got a couple of destroyer photos here. Another good example. This one attempts to nullify a bow wave. You've got a darker color up here on the bow where that water would be curling up white, and it's matched by a lighter color. The idea with these schemes is, what am I looking at? Where is it going? And it should be noted that by the very end of the war, when the kamikaze starts to become prevalent, you start to see these darker schemes disappear because it does tend to make your ship stick out a little bit. It's a little bit more conspicuous than if it was just a solid color. Here's an awesome photo of the Laffey from periscope view. This has an excellent false bow. So look at this photo really quickly. Is this ship coming directly at me, or is it crossing to the right of the view of this camera? It's easy enough to sort out if you sit here and you stare at it and you realize it's symmetrical and everything. But if you look really quickly and all you see is that bow and then that false bow off to the right, it's meant to create that little bit of confusion. Great photo of Murderer's Row. This is a good example of how diverse the camo can be. Individual ships can choose. You've got a lot going on here. You've got a hospital ship way up in the top left. You've got a graded battleship just to the left of that. Lower in that upper corner, you've got the Blue Ghost hanging out up there. You've got a CVL, and then you've got this row of Essex-class carriers that have been painted in a very similar scheme. There was a lot of debate about painting ships exactly the same, because if you make one pattern that's super unique, then every time the enemy sees it, they're like, oh, that's totally the USS Yorktown every single time. So you want some repetition of patterns, but you also don't want to make it so crazy that you've got a lot of logistical issues. And last, before we go, this one's just a personal favorite. This was an experimental scheme. This is PT-171. Obviously, this is not a practical wartime thing because they literally painted the covers on the guns and everything, but this is a mess to look at. Where's the bow? Where's the stern? What's going on here? It's pretty cool, and it's an excellent visualization of how you can use colors to really screw with your perception of a physical object. This one was never implemented in any sort of large way. It was part of an experimental program. But it's kind of a mind bender to look at, and so it's pretty entertaining. All right, so I'm going to switch back to good old Josh sitting here, and I've kind of come up with a way to visualize before I shift to questions, sort of show a few things. I think it shows a little bit different perspective than just photos. Because I'm a little nerd, I built models like 20 years ago, and ship models, and I always painted them in the appropriate camouflage for these ships. And so 20 years later, I've finally found a use for these things. They've been sitting in a box. So I have a blue room here. This is going to be our ocean. Obviously, the ocean is in brown, but we've got a model of the USS Arizona here. So hopefully this works. You've got gray. It's a gray ship. Blue ocean. In certain low light situations, it may be able to shift to a more bluish color. This is the pre-war thinking. It's convenient. It's easy on paint. But what's really neat is made this one this weekend, and you can kind of see the difference. Little eye doctor thing, better one, better two. So we look at the exact same ship model, but with a dazzled scheme on it. It really breaks it up. It's pretty interesting. We've got our stern here. We do have a false bow going on up there. It's just very stark. And so I had tried to figure out how to get a light in here to show contrast shadows, but it kept washing out the screen. So we're just going to look at Josh's painted models here for a second. So that's pretty interesting to see how a dazzled scheme really kind of messes with the outline and shape of that ship. And hopefully the internet is supporting the resolution of this. We've got one more to show, and it'll demonstrate why those early pattern schemes didn't work all that well. So we look here at the USS Hornet. We've got cool dappling. You know, it looks pretty awesome, especially when it's parked in port. And obviously I know that my modeling skills weren't that great when I was a little kid, but so ship looks pretty cool. You see it on horizon, you're like, all right, this is awesome. We can break up the shape. But this is really great demonstration of why they realize that these schemes are neat, but it's sort of a waste of paint, because once the ship starts to get anywhere decently far away, all those colors just blend together. You can't really even see the striping on the funnel. You can see a little bit of the splashing around the bottom, but in reality, with that straight line and everything on there, it doesn't break it up enough. So hopefully everyone has enjoyed Josh showing off his models. Still think that that was pretty awesome. It's just kind of a cool scheme. So I'm going to switch to some questions, if everyone will give me a chance to do some clicking and see what's going on here. A good one on here. Comment on the introduction of the 1943 Halsey gray uniform for camouflage of the officers on the deck of ships. This is it's a funny question, because it's kind of one of those things that someone invents in an office because it sounds like a really good idea. Like, oh man, if someone's standing on deck and they're wearing the wrong color uniform, they're totally going to make the entire ship stick out. So that was the thought behind that Halsey gray, is we've got officers wearing white or khaki, standing on deck of ships. You know, sailors are wearing, technically pre-war, they're not allowed to wear chambray and dungarees above decks. They're supposed to be wearing undress whites or undress blues. The point is all that stuff is meant to impress. And so, but they don't blend in with camouflage schemes. So Halsey gray was sort of introduced as a thought behind that, and it was sort of a new uniform, but it never really got adopted because there was just so much khaki out there already. They didn't have the time and the ability to shift all that, but you do see those things kind of pop out. Were models painted before actually being painted on a ship? Yes. The British had this whole cool little setup where they would make models and they would test the light reflectivity. You see the same thing in the US Navy, but they wouldn't ship the model out. They wouldn't send them the model. They would just send them that paint by numbers sheet to say, hey, check this thing out. Let's see. That PT boat were zebra, black and white. Most of those, it's like super contrasting colors, and so they like to use black and white on them, and that's part of that, you know, inspiration from the naturalists. Look at the zebra, let's recreate the zebra, which is another thing that a whole bunch of people, especially in the First World War, wanted to paint the bottoms of ships white because animals have white bellies, and they were really taking it to the extreme. Canadians painting their vessels light green. The Canadians followed the Royal Navy approach. The Royal Navy used a lot of greens and pastels because they blended in with what's called the northern approaches. Basically, for the most part, all the territorial water around Great Britain. So the British sort of have an inverse design relationship with us. They start World War II dazzling, with a lot of greens and blues and even teals and grays and things of that nature, and like pea soups. And then they start to kind of shift back to solid schemes by the end of the war, whereas we go full dazzle until we switch to solid schemes for aerial issues later in the war. Schemes of allies compared to Axis. The United States and the British are really the only ones that take camouflage to the extreme. Everybody does have a form of ship's camouflage. Everyone practice it. It's sort of like what's fascinating, the British and the American colors develop in two completely separate programs, but they basically arrive at the same colors because they're the colors that are dictated by nature and by your eyes. So a lot of countries use this stuff, whether or not it's applied in any sort of methodical way or useful way. It's not as cleanly organized as the United States and Great Britain, but you see, you know, individual submarine commanders in the Kriegsmarine taking advantage of things. You see Japanese ships painted up. Bismarck famously has got, you know, the false bow checks painted on it. So everyone does it. No one does it to the extreme that we did. Good question. Most effective for battleships. What is the pattern that's most effective? It just depends. You know, what is this ship doing? If this ship is an OBB, an old battleship, and she is probably a Pearl Harbor survivor and is part of bombardment task forces supporting invasions in the Pacific, she's probably painted a solid scheme because she needs more anti-aircraft defense than ship of the line. Whereas if you've got a modern fast battleship, if they're engaging in a gunnery duel, those 31, 32, and 33 dazzle schemes or deceptive schemes are the ones to go for those time and situations. Changing Navy warfare too, some things move so quick you can't repaint the ship. The Missouri had that awesome paint job on it, and she got repainted almost as soon as she got overseas because it didn't work for what she was going to be doing. So it's hit or miss with those things. Let's see. Did ship's company paint the ship, or was it done by yard staff? A little bit of everything. There's actually a Navy rate that is a painter, but don't always have to have those. Kind of like having a sailmaker around. Most part, the ship's company did the painting. Usually, if it's in dry dock, there is going to be support staff there that'll be doing it, and they may apply the scheme because they tried to put those new schemes with major dock refits. But if you need to do it in theater or you need something for your crew to do, you're going to set them to painting it. Painting is also, should have mentioned this earlier, it's not just let's color the ship to make it cool or make it disappear. Paint is very important on ships to just keep ships in good shape. It is a protective coating, stops them from rusting, you know, kind of helps proof areas and everything. There's non-skid material that you put on it so you don't go sliding down the deck. It's basically sand. So there's a lot that goes into it. They realize that, like, well, we're already putting it on the ship, so we could just color it as well and get another advantage of it. Royal Navy, Mountbatten Pink. Yeah, it was I think it was Lord Louis Mountbatten was sitting. It was sitting on the deck of a ship, and he looked off and saw a British civilian cruise liner that had sort of this like salmon pinky color, and he realized that it blended in with the setting sun. And so the Brits used that ugly, ugly pink color that blended in with the sun setting. It's called Mountbatten Pink. Takes a long time to paint a ship. Yeah. You know, we painted our PT boat, 78-foot boat, and we had a air conditioned warehouse. And to do about this earlier, when you go to a museum ship, even if you get kind of annoyed when maybe someone's blocking the ladder, there's a few people, you don't realize that these ships were absolutely packed with people. So there was maintenance constantly going on. So it wasn't like, all right, it's Saturday, let's paint the ship. It was working parties were constantly working on this material. So it sort of happened all. You just needed to make sure that the right colors were being placed in the right areas. Feedback from the fleet about camouflage effectiveness. Everyone always has an opinion. And it's interesting, you know, a lot of people are skeptical of what comes from behind the lines, and then a lot of the people from behind the lines think that the upfront people don't really know what's going on up there. People did report, and there was actually communication. I do know of one specific instance, and I'm sure it was that way, because the Navy is really good about trying to digest the lessons it learned and keep open communications about a lot of things. And so this kind of stuff would be mentioned in action reports. When we were working on the PT 305 with the museum, actually was able to find a document that listed some of the experimental schemes they were trying in that PT squadron in the Mediterranean. So they painted them on individual ships, and then they sent them back and said, hey, this worked, this didn't. And then they actually got suggestions in return that said, well, you need to try this, this, and this. So there's a little bit of collaboration there. But for the most part, especially later in the war, they just issued those schemes. And they ended up looking pretty cool, that a lot of people just enjoyed having them on their ship anyway. Oh, let's see. We have a couple more here. How often were ship colors changed? It kind of depends. If you're in a situation where you can have access to a lot of paint or maintenance facilities or anything like that, then you may shift it per every campaign or action. But there were some ships, like especially destroyers, that get stuck on escort duties or go out to the Pacific and they just bing bong bouncing around everywhere. Sometimes they don't get painted for quite a long time, and they come in looking pretty ratty. So it's a huge war, a lot of ships. It's a difficult one to answer without any sort of certainty. All right, I got about one more in here. Modern Navy uniforms. Yeah, I don't get the blueberry either. Inflatables for the use for D-Day, were they camouflaged? They made them a little bit more conspicuous from the Navy standpoint. But like I said, if you've got a photo of even a camouflage real ship, you can sit there and kind of sort the photo itself out. So with any amount of time, you can figure it out. But yeah, you don't want to make it clear that your fake ship is fake right off the bat. You kind of want to sell it just a little bit, but at the same time, you don't want to spend a lot of time in paint stocks and everything sort of supporting that. All right, I think let's see if I've got any more questions, and then I think that may be it. Very good question. The tops of decks and main batteries painted something other than gray. All right, so there is two types of aerial observation. There's, kind of looking down at it, and then there's looking straight down, or at least from a really high angle. And so pretty much every camouflage scheme we see, I've only shown horizontal views. It's almost always the same color from straight down. Hopefully something doesn't fall off this thing. But you paint all this cool, crazy stuff on there, but then the deck is just painted what's called deck blue. And that's pretty much across the board. Any scheme you see, they're going to paint it one solid color, so that if you're straight down or at least high angle observation, you're just seeing blue on blue, water on water.